Hello friends! Tonight we begin with the story of how people survived the Great Irish Famine, 1845-1852, written in English with a distinctly British style and vocabulary. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, do support me with a like and a subscription. It truly helps the channel grow. And do write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps let a fan hum quietly in the background, and let us set out together on this night's journey. There are scents that never leave a man's memory, though he may live 1,000 years beyond their source. The smell of rotting potatoes is one such thing, sweet at first, like fruit left too long in summer sun, then turning to something altogether more sinister. A smell that spoke not merely of spoiled food, but of the slow thinning of life itself. I was but 17 years when the black wind first swept across our fields in County Cork in that terrible autumn of 1845. 17, and filled with the quiet certainty that the world held its proper order, that seasons would follow seasons, that the earth would yield its bounty, that a man might plant and harvest and feed his family, as his fathers had done before him. How swiftly such certainties can crumble, like poorly built walls before a storm. Our holding was small, perhaps 3 acres of good land rented from Mr. Hartwell, an Englishman who visited twice yearly to collect his rents and departed as quickly as his carriage could bear him. The cabin where I lived with my parents, Paddy and Bridget O'Brien, and my younger sister Mare, was built of rough stone and clay, with a roof of thatch that required constant mending. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by generations of bare feet, and in winter the walls wept with moisture that no fire could entirely banish. Yet it was home, and we were not unhappy. My father was a strong man, broad-shouldered from working the land, with hands that could coax growth from the most reluctant soil. My mother possessed that particular Irish gift for making much from little. She could stretch a pot of stirabout to feed unexpected guests, could mend clothes so skillfully that patches became decoration, could sing while she worked in a voice that made even the heaviest labour seem lighter. Mare was 14 then, with the dark hair and pale skin common to our people, and eyes the colour of the sea on a grey day. She had a laugh that could lift the spirits of the sourest neighbour, and a way of finding beauty in the smallest things, a handful of wildflowers, the pattern frost made on our single window, the way morning mist clung to the hedgerows. Our lives revolved around the potato, as did the lives of most Irish folk. 3 times daily we gathered around our rough wooden table to break our fast, take our dinner, and sup, and each meal was much the same. Potatoes boiled in their skins, perhaps with a bit of salt when we could afford it, sometimes with buttermilk when the cow was giving well. On Sundays, or when the priest came calling, there might be a scrap of bacon or a handful of oats made into stirabout. The potato was our salvation and our sustenance. A single acre could feed a family for a year, and we grew the finest lumpers you ever did see, large, flowery tubers that filled the belly and gave a man strength for his work. My father would examine each hill with the care of a priest reading scripture, checking for signs of disease or pest, ensuring proper drainage, calculating yields with the precision of a scholar. That September morning when everything changed began like any other. The mist hung low over our fields, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and burning peat from the hearths of our neighbours. I had risen before dawn, as was my custom, to tend to our few animals, a cow, 2 pigs, and a handful of chickens that scratched about the yard with determined optimism. The first sign of trouble was silence. Not the comfortable quiet of early morning, but something deeper, more unsettling. The birds that usually chattered in the hawthorn hedge were still. Even our old dog Paddy seemed restless, pacing about the yard and whining softly. My father emerged from the cabin as I was drawing water from our well, his face already creased with the day's concerns. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned to conserve his strength, but there was something in his manner that spoke of unease. Together we walked to the potato field, our boots squelching in the soft earth still damp from the previous night's rain. The plants looked healthy enough from a distance, green and vigorous, their leaves catching the pale morning light. But as we drew closer, my father's steps slowed, and I heard him draw in his breath sharply. The smell hit us first, that sweet, cloying odour that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. Then we saw what had happened overnight. Where yesterday there had been healthy plants, now the leaves hung black and withered, as if they had been touched by fire. The stalks themselves seemed to collapse before our eyes, folding in upon themselves like flowers closing at dusk. My father knelt beside one of the hills and began to dig with his bare hands, his movements quick and desperate. The potatoes he pulled from the earth were no longer the firm white tubers we had tended with such care. They were black and soft, dissolving at his touch into a foul-smelling pulp that seemed to mock our months of labour. Hill after hill told the same story. Our crop, our year's sustenance, our rent money, our very survival, had been transformed overnight into rotting waste. The disease that would come to be known as the blight had arrived in our corner of Ireland, and with it came the beginning of sorrows that would test our people beyond all endurance. I watched my father's hands shake as he examined potato after potato, each one bringing fresh confirmation of our disaster. His face, weathered by 45 years of labour and worry, seemed to age a decade in those few moments. When he finally stood, brushing the black pulp from his fingers, his eyes held a look I had never seen before. Not despair, not yet, but the first cold recognition of what lay ahead. We returned to the cabin in silence. My mother was stirring the morning stirabout, humming one of the old songs under her breath. Mare sat by the fire, mending a tear in her woolen petticoat, her needle flashing in the firelight. The scene was so ordinary, so untouched by the catastrophe that had befallen us mere yards away, that I almost believed we might have dreamed it all. But the smell clung to our clothes, and when my father spoke, his words carried the weight of finality. The crop is gone. Every hill, every plant, the blight has taken it all. My mother's spoon stilled in the pot. Mare looked up from her sewing, her young face creasing with confusion. In that moment, I understood that childhood for all of us was ending. The comfortable certainties of our small world had cracked like ice in spring, and we were about to discover what lay beneath. That first day we did not speak much of what it meant. We ate our stirabout in silence, each of us lost in private calculations of what little remained in our store. My mother counted and recounted our few shillings, as if the coins might multiply under her touch. My father sat by the fire, staring into the flames with the intensity of a man seeking visions, but already the news was spreading. Throughout that day, neighbours appeared at our door, their faces telling the same story our field had told. The Kellys from down the lane, the Murphys from across the hill, old Mrs. O'Sullivan with her 3 grandsons, all bearing witness to the same disaster. The blight had swept through our district like a plague, sparing nothing and no one. By evening, we learned the full scope of what had befallen us. Father McBride arrived on his ancient horse, his usually cheerful countenance grave with the weight of terrible news. The disease was not confined to our small corner of County Cork. Reports were coming from across Ireland, from Donegal to Kerry, from Galway to Waterford. The potato crop, upon which nearly 8 million of our countrymen depended for their very lives, had failed across the length and breadth of the island. The priest sat at our table, his long hands wrapped around a cup of nettle tea, for we had no proper tea to offer, and spoke in measured tones of what we might expect. There would be hardship, certainly. There would be hunger. But the Almighty would provide, as he always had. Relief would come from somewhere, from England, perhaps, or from the landlords, or from the government workhouses that had been established for such emergencies. As he spoke, I watched my father's face. The hope that flickered there was real, but fragile as a candle flame in wind. My father had lived through hard times before, the bitter winter of 1839, the failed harvest of 1842. But nothing like this, nothing that threatened the very foundation of our existence. That night, as I lay on my pallet of straw beside the dying fire, I listened to my parents' voices in the darkness. They spoke in whispers, as if loud words might somehow make our situation worse, but their urgent tones carried clearly in the still air. There might be work on the roads, my father was saying. The government sometimes paid men to build walls and mend lanes when times were hard. Or perhaps we might find employment at the big houses, though work was scarce there too and grew scarcer with each passing season. My mother spoke of our few possessions: a wooden chest that had belonged to her grandmother, a set of pewter spoons, the Sunday dress she had worn to her wedding 15 years past. Such things might be sold, if buyers could be found. Every shilling would matter now. But underneath their practical planning ran a current of something deeper and darker. They spoke of families they had known in their youth during the last great hunger in 1822, whole households that had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed them entire. Children found wandering the roads, their eyes empty of everything but the most basic instinct to continue breathing. Men and women who had walked away from their homes one morning and were never seen again. Would you recognize despair by its silence? I learned that autumn that despair comes not with wailing or the tearing of clothes, but with the quiet acceptance of the unacceptable. It comes when a man stops making plans beyond the next day, when a woman begins to ration not just food, but hope itself. October brought the first real taste of what lay ahead. Our small store of sound potatoes, carefully hoarded from the previous year's harvest, dwindled with alarming speed. We had been accustomed to eating perhaps a dozen large potatoes each day. Now we made do with 3 or 4 small ones, eked out with whatever else we could find. Nettle soup became a staple, made from the young plants that grew along our stone walls. My mother showed remarkable ingenuity in discovering what could be safely eaten dandelion leaves, the inner bark of certain trees, even grass when prepared properly. We learned to be grateful for things we had never considered food before. The social order that had governed our community began to shift in subtle ways. Neighbours who had once shared freely now hoarded jealously. Children who had played together were warned away from other families' gardens. The easy generosity that had characterised Irish rural life gave way to a careful calculation of resources that would have been unthinkable mere months before. Yet in some ways, the bonds between us grew stronger. The Kellys, whose situation was even more desperate than our own, they had 6 children to feed, shared our Sunday table, and we shared what little we had. Old Mrs. O'Sullivan, whose grandsons had found work in Cork City, left anonymous gifts of bread at our door. Father McBride organised prayer meetings that were as much about sharing information as seeking divine intervention. It was during one of these gatherings that we first heard talk of the relief works that were being established. The government in London, we were told, had recognised the severity of our situation and was prepared to offer employment to able-bodied men. The pay would be modest, perhaps 8p a day, but it would provide the means to buy food when food could be found. My father's name was entered on the list of those seeking such employment, along with most of the other men in our district. We waited for word with the patience of fishermen watching their nets, knowing that our survival might depend upon the whims of distant officials who had never seen an Irish potato field or smelled the particular desperation of a cabin where the last meal has been consumed. November brought the rains, not the gentle showers that farmers welcome, but driving, relentless downpours that turned every path into a river of mud and every field into a bog. Our cabin, never entirely watertight, became a soggy misery of dripping thatch and running walls. The fire, our only source of warmth and the means by which my mother cooked our meagre meals, struggled constantly against the damp. It was then that word came of the relief work. A road was to be built, or rather, rebuilt, connecting our district to the market town of Mill Street, some 12 miles distant. The project was expected to provide employment for perhaps 30 men for the better part of the winter, and wages would be paid weekly in coin rather than goods. My father was among those selected, a blessing that seemed almost miraculous in light of our circumstances. Each morning before dawn he would join the line of men trudging through the mud to the work site, carrying the few tools he possessed, a shovel worn smooth by years of use, a pick that had belonged to his father, a wooden-handled hammer that he had crafted himself. The work was brutal. The men were required to move enormous quantities of stone and earth to level ground that had never been intended for a roadway, to build culverts and lay foundations in weather that seemed designed to defeat human ambition. They worked from sunrise to sunset, with only a brief respite at midday to consume whatever food they had been able to bring from home. Yet my father returned each evening with a satisfaction I had rarely seen in him before. The work was honest labour, and the weekly wage of 4 shillings and sixpence represented genuine hope. We could buy oatmeal now when it was available. We could afford the occasional piece of bacon or herring. We could pay our rent to Mr. Hartwell and maintain our place on the land. But even as our immediate situation improved, the broader picture grew more dire. Reports reached us of conditions in other parts of Ireland that beggared description. In Mayo and Roscommon, entire villages had been abandoned as their inhabitants sought work or relief elsewhere. In the cities, crowds of desperate people gathered daily outside the relief offices, begging for any opportunity to earn a few pence. The newspapers that occasionally found their way to our district painted a picture of a country in the grip of something approaching catastrophe. The normal mechanisms of commerce had broken down. Farmers with grain to sell could find no buyers with money to purchase it. Merchants who might normally have extended credit now demanded payment in advance. The intricate web of relationships that had sustained rural Irish society was unravelling with frightening speed. It was during this period that we began to hear of the ships. In Cork and Dublin, in Galway and Belfast, vessels were departing weekly for America, carrying human cargo more precious than any commercial freight. Irish families, some with resources enough to pay for passage, others working off their fares through labour contracts, were abandoning the land of their birth in search of survival on distant shores. The idea was not entirely foreign to us. There had always been Irish people in America. We knew families who had received letters from relatives in places with strange names like Boston and New York, places where it was said a man might earn enough in a day to feed his family for a week. But these had seemed like fairy tales, stories too wonderful to be entirely believed. Now, as winter deepened and the relief work continued, emigration began to seem less like fantasy and more like practical necessity. The conversations around our fire turned increasingly to calculations of passage money, discussions of which ships were most seaworthy, speculation about what life might be like in a land where potatoes were merely one crop among many. My sister Mare, who had always possessed a dreamer's temperament, was the first to speak openly of her desire to attempt the crossing. She had heard from Father McBride of Irish girls who found employment as domestic servants in the great houses of American cities, who earned wages that would have seemed princely to any servant in Ireland, who wrote letters home describing lives of comfort and security that must surely exist only in the realm of imagination. My parents' reaction to such talk was complex. They were practical people who understood that the Ireland they had known, the Ireland in which a family might live for generations on the same small holding, passing their modest prosperity from father to son like an heirloom, was disappearing before our eyes. Yet the thought of losing their children to an ocean that might as well have been another world filled them with a dread that no amount of practical reasoning could dispel. December brought the first real test of our endurance. The relief work continued, but the wages that had seemed so generous in November proved increasingly inadequate as food prices rose throughout the country. A stone of oatmeal that had cost 3 shillings in the autumn now commanded 5. Bread, when it could be found at all, sold for prices that would have been unthinkable in normal times. We learned to make soup from bones that had already been boiled twice. We discovered that potato skins, carefully cleaned and cooked, could provide at least the illusion of substance. We gathered seaweed from the rocky shores 15 miles away, carrying it home in canvas sacks to dry by our fire and add to our meagre stores. The changes in our bodies were subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. My father's powerful frame began to lose its bulk, his face taking on the gaunt appearance that would become common throughout Ireland. My mother's hands, always slim, became almost skeletal, the bones clearly visible beneath skin that seemed stretched too thin. Mare's laughter, once so ready and infectious, became a precious commodity, saved for moments of genuine joy that grew rarer with each passing week. Yet it was not merely the physical changes that marked the passage of those terrible months. Something was shifting in the very character of our community, in the relationships between people who had known each other since childhood. Trust, once given freely, was now parcelled out with the same care as food. Generosity, once a mark of social standing, became a luxury that few could afford. I remember particularly one evening in January when Mrs. Kelly appeared at our door carrying her youngest child, a boy of perhaps 2 years who had not spoken in weeks. The child's eyes, once bright with mischief, had taken on the peculiar empty quality that we were learning to recognize, not the emptiness of stupidity, but of a mind that had retreated from a world too harsh to comprehend. My mother took the child in her arms without question, though I knew we had barely enough food for ourselves. She heated the last of our milk and fed it to him spoonful by careful spoonful, crooning one of the old songs in Irish while she worked. Mrs. Kelly wept silently, not from sadness alone, but from the terrible gratitude of a woman who had been reduced to begging for her child's survival. The boy improved over the next few days, as if love itself had nutritional properties. But the incident marked a turning point in my understanding of what was happening to us. We were not merely experiencing temporary hardship, not simply enduring a difficult season that would pass with the coming of spring. We were witnessing the systematic breakdown of everything that had given shape and meaning to Irish rural life. It was then that the letters began to arrive from America. Not in great numbers, for literacy was not common among our people, and the cost of postage was prohibitive for all but the most successful emigrants. But enough came through to fuel the dreams of those contemplating the crossing. One such letter found its way to Father McBride, sent by a young man named Timothy O'Connor, who had departed Cork the previous spring. Timothy wrote of work in a place called Massachusetts, where Irish labourers were building railways through forests so vast that a man might walk for weeks without seeing cleared land. The wages he described seemed fantastic, as much as $1 a day for common labour, and he claimed to be sending money home to bring over his sister and aged parents. The priest read portions of this letter aloud during his weekly visits, though he was careful to temper the enthusiasm it generated with warnings about the difficulties of ocean travel and the challenges of life in a foreign land. Still, the words took root in minds already prepared to consider any alternative to slow decline into destitution. My father spoke of little else through the remainder of January. He would sit by our fire, using a stick to sketch maps in the dirt floor maps of Ireland, maps of the Atlantic Ocean, maps of America based on the fragmentary information that reached us through letters and newspapers. He calculated passage money with the precision of a merchant, compared the relative merits of different ship lines, debated the advantages of various American destinations with the intensity of a scholar. Yet for all his planning, I could see that the prospect terrified him. He was 45 years old, a man whose skills and knowledge were intimately tied to the particular soil of County Cork. The thought of beginning again in a land where the seasons followed different patterns, where the crops were unfamiliar, where the language, though English, was spoken with accents that might as well have been foreign tongues, challenged everything he understood about himself and his place in the world. February brought news that changed our situation dramatically. The relief works were to be discontinued. The government in London had decided that such programs created an unhealthy dependence upon public charity, that the Irish people would be better served by learning to rely upon their own resources and initiative. The announcement fell upon our district like a physical blow. 30 men who had counted upon those weekly wages found themselves once again facing the prospect of winter with no income, no resources, and dwindling hope. The road that had occupied their labours for nearly 4 months remained unfinished, a monument to the vagaries of distant policymakers who had never experienced the particular desperation of watching one's children grow thinner with each passing day. It was then that my father made his decision. We would go to America. Not all of us immediately. The cost of 4 passages was beyond our means, but my sister, Mare, and I would make the crossing that spring, establishing ourselves in the new world and eventually sending for our parents when we had earned sufficient funds. The announcement was made during our evening meal, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone my father used for all important decisions. There was no discussion, no debate about the wisdom of such a course. The logic was inescapable. We could no longer survive in Ireland, and America offered at least the possibility of life. Mare received the news with an excitement she tried unsuccessfully to contain. For weeks she had been dreaming of American cities, of opportunities that existed nowhere in Ireland, of a future that stretched beyond the narrow horizons of tenant farming. Her eyes shone with anticipation as my father described his plans, how we would sail from Cork to Boston, how I would find work immediately upon arrival, how she would seek employment as a domestic servant until such time as more suitable arrangements could be made. My own feelings were more complex. At 19, I'd never travelled more than 20 miles from the place of my birth. The prospect of crossing an ocean to a land I knew only through fragments of letters and newspaper accounts filled me with equal measures of excitement and terror. Yet I understood, as clearly as my father did, that remaining in Ireland meant accepting a slow diminishment that could end only in the complete dissolution of our family. My mother said nothing during this discussion, but I saw her hands tremble as she cleared our simple meal. Later that night, I heard her weeping softly, the sound muffled by the bedclothes but unmistakable in the close confines of our cabin. She was losing her children to necessity, and no amount of practical reasoning could ease the particular anguish of a mother's heart. The next months passed with the strange acceleration that attends momentous decisions. There were arrangements to be made, documents to be obtained, passage money to be gathered from sources I had never imagined. My father sold our few pieces of furniture, including the wooden chest that had belonged to my mother's grandmother. Our cow, beloved companion of many years, was taken to market in Cork and exchanged for a sum that seemed magnificent until we learned the cost of ship passage. Every possession was evaluated for its potential contribution to our escape fund. My mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved through 15 years of marriage, was sold to a dealer in second-hand goods. My father's tools, the implements by which he had earned our living, were gradually disposed of as it became clear that their weight would be prohibitive on the crossing, and that American labour would require different skills and equipment. By March, we had accumulated sufficient funds for 2 passages on a ship called the Irish Star, scheduled to depart Cork Harbour in the second week of April. The vessel was described in the shipping advertisements as a fine bark of 400 tons, fitted with every convenience for the comfort of passengers, though we learned from those with more experience that such descriptions bore little relation to the actual conditions aboard emigrant ships. The final weeks before our departure were marked by a series of goodbyes that tore at the heart with each repetition. Neighbours we had known since childhood came to wish us well, to share memories of better times, to entrust us with messages for relatives who had preceded us across the ocean. Each visit was a small funeral, marking the end of relationships that had provided the social fabric of our lives. Father McBride performed a special blessing for us, asking the protection of St. Christopher for our journey and St. Joseph for our labours in the New World. He pressed into my hand a small wooden crucifix that had belonged to his predecessor, charging me to remember always the faith of my fathers and to maintain the practices of our holy religion in whatever circumstances I might encounter. The most difficult farewell was with our parents. On the morning of our departure, my father insisted upon walking with us to the main road where the mail coach would carry us to Cork. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man savouring final moments, pointing out landmarks that had shaped our shared history. The oak tree where he had carved his and my mother's initials 30 years before, the field where he had taught me to plough, the stream where we had often fished on summer evenings. My mother could not bring herself to leave the cabin. She stood in the doorway as we made our preparations, her face composed, but her eyes betraying the depth of her anguish. When the moment came for final embraces, she held us with desperate intensity, as if physical contact might somehow bridge the ocean that was about to separate us. The promises we made then seem almost comical in retrospect. We would write every week. We would send money as soon as employment was secured. We would bring them to America within 2 years at the outside. We spoke with the confidence of youth, certain that determination alone could overcome any obstacle, that the bond between parents and children could survive any separation. The coach ride to Cork provided my first glimpse of the broader catastrophe that had befallen our country. The roads were crowded with people moving in every direction, some, like ourselves, bound for the ports and the promise of escape, others simply wandering with the aimless desperation of those who had exhausted all possibilities. We passed through villages that appeared almost deserted, their cabins standing empty with doors that hung open to reveal bare rooms where families had once lived. In Cork City itself, the evidence of our national calamity was even more striking. The streets teemed with people clearly marked by hunger and desperation. Whole families camped in doorways, their possessions reduced to what could be carried in a single bundle. Children who should have been playing wandered the streets with the grave expressions of adults, their eyes holding knowledge no child should possess. The harbour was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Ships of every description crowded the quays, some taking on passengers for America, others delivering what little relief supplies were arriving from England and Scotland. The noise was overwhelming. Shouting stevedores, crying children, the creak of rigging and the splash of waves against hulls. Our ship, the Irish Star, proved to be somewhat smaller than I had imagined, and considerably less elegant than her name suggested. She was a working vessel, built for cargo rather than passengers, hastily converted to accommodate the flood of emigrants seeking passage to the New World. The accommodations we had purchased, a steerage passage for 2 persons, entitled us to sleeping space in the hold, and access to cooking facilities that would be shared among perhaps 60 other passengers. The night before departure, we stayed in a lodging house near the harbour, a grim establishment that charged extortionate rates for beds that were little more than straw pallets arranged in rows. Sleep was impossible amid the noise and confusion, but I was grateful for the hours of darkness that postponed the final severing of all ties to the land of our birth. Morning brought a grey sky that seemed to match our sombre mood. We joined the queue of passengers waiting to board, each person or family clutching their few possessions and the precious documents that represented their legal right to passage. The crowd was overwhelmingly Irish, but I could see representatives of other troubled nationalities, Germans fleeing political upheaval, Scots displaced by agricultural changes, Englishmen seeking opportunities unavailable at home. The boarding process was deliberately humiliating, designed to emphasize our new status as cargo rather than passengers. We were examined by ship's officers like livestock being evaluated for sale, our few belongings searched for contraband, our health assessed with the casual indifference of men accustomed to dealing with human misery in large quantities. Mare bore these indignities with remarkable composure, though I could see the shock in her eyes as we descended into the hold that would be our home for the next 6 to 8 weeks. The space was divided into rough berths, each measuring perhaps 6 feet by 3, with barely enough headroom for an adult to sit upright. The air was already thick with the mingled odours of unwashed bodies, damp wood, and the bilge water that sloshed somewhere below us. Our fellow passengers represented a cross-section of Irish society united by desperation. There were farmers like ourselves, their hands still stained by the soil they would never see again. There were tradesmen whose skills had become worthless in a country where no one could afford to pay for services. There were young women travelling alone, seeking domestic employment in American cities, and mothers with children who cried ceaselessly in the alien environment of the ship. The departure itself was almost anticlimactic. One moment we were tied to the quay, still connected to Ireland by ropes and gangplanks, and the next we were moving slowly through the harbour, pushed by a tide that seemed determined to carry us away from everything we had ever known. I stood on deck as long as the officers would permit, watching the Irish coast recede until it became merely a smudge on the horizon, then disappeared entirely. That night, as the ship rolled in the Atlantic swells and the sounds of seasickness echoed through the hold, I realized that we had crossed more than water. We had passed from one world to another, from a life bounded by familiar certainties to one that offered nothing but possibility and peril in equal measure. The crossing proved to be every bit as difficult as we had been warned, and in some ways worse. The Irish Star was not a passenger ship in any meaningful sense, and the accommodations provided bore no relation to human comfort or dignity. We were packed into the hold like cargo, sleeping on rough wooden shelves with barely enough room to turn over, sharing cooking and sanitary facilities that would have been inadequate for half our number. Disease spread through the ship with the inevitability of fire through dry grass. Within a week of departure, the dreaded ship fever had claimed its first victims, an elderly man from Donegal and a child who could not have been more than 3 years old. Their bodies were committed to the waves with a brevity that spoke more of practical necessity than religious sentiment, wrapped in canvas shrouds and consigned to depths that would forever remain their only monument. Could you believe that a people might survive on nothing but hope and thin broth? The food provided by the ship was barely adequate for healthy adults, and proved entirely insufficient for passengers already weakened by months of near starvation. We were given a daily ration of water that would not have satisfied a man engaged in normal labour, and ship's biscuit so hard it had to be soaked before it could be eaten. Those who had brought their own provisions shared when they could, but most families had exhausted their resources simply paying for passage. Mare proved remarkably resilient during these trials. Where others succumbed to despair or illness, she maintained a quiet strength that became a source of comfort to fellow passengers. She helped tend the sick when others were too frightened of contagion to offer assistance. She organised the women into groups that shared cooking duties and childcare responsibilities. She sang the old Irish songs in the evening, when the day's miseries seemed too heavy to bear alone. My own experience of the crossing was marked by a gradual shedding of everything that had once defined my identity. The skills that had made me valuable in rural Ireland, my knowledge of crops and livestock, my familiarity with local customs and relationships were worthless aboard ship and would be only marginally more useful in America. I was learning to see myself not as Seamus O'Brien of County Cork, heir to generations of tenant farmers, but simply as another Irish immigrant seeking survival in a foreign land. The ship's crew treated us with a mixture of professional indifference and active contempt. We were cargo that happened to be alive, a source of problems and complaints that interfered with the serious business of navigation. The officers maintained strict separation between themselves and the passenger areas, appearing among us only when absolutely necessary, and then with expressions that suggested they were entering a barnyard. Yet even in these circumstances, human nature found ways to assert itself. Friendships formed among people who might never have spoken to each other on dry land. A man from Galway who had been a blacksmith taught others to play cards with a deck he had fashioned from torn paper. A woman from Limerick who had worked as a seamstress organised sewing circles that produced clothes for children who had outgrown their few possessions. Religion provided another source of cohesion. Each evening, those who were able would gather for prayers, led by a seminarian from Maynooth who was travelling to continue his studies in Baltimore. The familiar Latin words of the Rosary provided comfort that transcended our immediate circumstances, connecting us to traditions that stretched back through generations of Irish Catholics who had endured persecution and hardship. The most difficult aspect of the crossing was not the physical discomfort, or even the constant threat of disease, but the gradual realization that we were becoming different people with each mile we travelled from shore. The Ireland we carried in our memories was already changing, becoming fixed and romanticized in ways that bore little relation to the harsh realities we had fled. We were creating a new version of Irishness that would be shaped by exile rather than homeland, by loss rather than possession. By the fourth week of the voyage, the weakest passengers were beginning to fail. The combination of poor food, contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, and the stress of the journey itself proved too much for those who had arrived already weakened by months of hunger. Each morning brought the discovery of someone who had passed away during the night. Their suffering finally ended, but their dreams of America buried with them beneath the waves. I found myself appointed to assist with the increasingly frequent burials at sea. The process had been reduced to grim efficiency. Bodies were examined by the ship's doctor to confirm that they had indeed reached their final rest, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, and committed to the ocean with prayers that grew shorter and more perfunctory as their frequency increased. We learned to perform these duties with the emotional detachment that survival demanded, though each splash in the dark water marked the failure of another family's hopes for reunion in the new world. Mare was among those who contracted the fever in the 5th week. I watched helplessly as the bright vitality that had always characterized her began to ebb away, replaced by the hollow-eyed listlessness that preceded either recovery or the final rest. For 3 days, she lay on our narrow berth, burning with heat that no amount of precious water could cool, muttering words in Irish that seemed to come from some distant country of the mind. On the 4th night, her fever broke. I woke to find her sitting upright, weak but lucid, asking for water in a voice that was barely a whisper but unmistakably her own. The relief I felt was so overwhelming that I wept openly, not caring who might witness such an unmanly display of emotion. Her recovery marked a turning point in our voyage. The weather, which had been consistently foul, began to moderate. The seas that had tossed our ship like a child's toy grew calmer. Most importantly, the rate of sickness began to slow, as if the fever had exhausted the most vulnerable among us, and was now content to let the survivors complete their journey. In the 7th week, we caught our first glimpse of the American coast. It appeared as nothing more than a smudge on the distant horizon, but the effect on our fellow passengers was electric. People who had not left their berths in days suddenly found strength to climb on deck. Conversations that had been conducted in whispers for weeks resumed their normal volume. Even the ship's crew seemed to acquire a measure of humanity as the end of their ordeal with their difficult cargo came into sight. Boston Harbour, when we finally entered it on a grey morning in early June, seemed like a vision from another world. The activity on the waterfront dwarfed anything we had known in Cork. Ships from every nation lined the quays, their holds disgorging goods from places whose names existed only in atlas pages. Stevedores worked with mechanical efficiency, their movements choreographed by years of practice. The sounds of commerce shouting, hammering, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones created a symphony of prosperity that was both thrilling and intimidating. The processing of immigrants was conducted with the same efficiency that characterized all American commerce. We were herded into long queues, examined once again by officials who spoke English with accents that made our own brogues seem exotic, questioned about our intentions and resources with a thoroughness that suggested suspicion was the default attitude toward new arrivals. Mayor and I emerged from this ordeal with documents that proclaimed us legal residents of Massachusetts, free to seek employment and establish ourselves as we saw fit. We also carried with us the address of a boarding house in the Irish district, where we might find temporary accommodation at rates we could afford, at least until work was secured. The boarding house proved to be a 3-story wooden building that housed perhaps 40 recent immigrants in conditions that were scarcely better than those aboard ship. We shared a room no larger than a closet with 2 other young women from County Mayo, sleeping on straw mattresses that were replaced weekly whether they needed it or not. The meals provided consisted mainly of bread and thin soup, though they were served at regular hours and in quantities sufficient to begin restoring our depleted strength. Within a week of our arrival, I'd found employment at a construction site where Irish labourers were building a railway line that would eventually connect Boston to cities whose names I could barely pronounce. The work was brutally hard-moving earth and stone in quantities that challenged every muscle in my body, but the wages were exactly as advertised in the letters we had received. $1 per day, paid weekly in American currency, represented more money than I had ever handled in my life. Mayor's situation proved more complex. Employment for Irish women was available, but only in positions that reflected the social hierarchy of our new country. She could work as a domestic servant in the homes of established Americans, scrubbing floors and tending children for families who regarded Irish immigrants as a necessary but regrettable addition to their society. The wages were adequate, perhaps $3 per week, plus room and board, but the social isolation was complete. She found a position with the Whitman family, Protestant Yankees whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower and who maintained their household with the rigid discipline of their Puritan heritage. Mrs. Whitman was not unkind, but she made it clear that Mayor's primary virtues were her willingness to work hard and her acceptance of conditions that no American-born woman would tolerate. The first months in Boston were marked by a gradual accumulation of small victories over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. We learned to navigate the city's streets, to understand the peculiarities of American commerce, to speak English with fewer of the inflections that immediately identified us as recent arrivals. We opened accounts at the Irish American Bank, depositing our carefully hoarded wages against the day when we might send for our parents. Yet for all our material progress, we remained exiles in ways that went deeper than language or customs. The America we encountered bore little resemblance to the golden land described in immigrant letters. The streets were not paved with opportunity for everyone who chose to walk them. Success, when it came at all, was earned through labour that left little time for the cultivation of dreams. The Irish community in Boston provided both support and limitation. We worshipped at St. Patrick's Church, where Mass was celebrated with the same solemnity we had known in County Cork, but where the congregation reflected the diversity of Irish emigration farmers and labourers, certainly, but also merchants and professionals who had fled not starvation, but the narrowing opportunities of a colonial economy. Within this community, news from Ireland arrived with the regularity of seasonal tides. Letters brought word of continued suffering, of relief efforts that proved inadequate to the scale of need, of entire districts that had been abandoned as their populations scattered to the four winds. We learned of families we had known since childhood, simply disappearing, as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. More disturbingly, we began to receive reports of conditions aboard other emigrant ships that made our own difficult crossing seem fortunate by comparison. Vessels where disease had claimed half the passengers before landfall was reached, ships where captains had failed to provide even the minimal rations required by law, leaving immigrants to survive on whatever they had been able to bring aboard. Stories of harbour officials in Quebec and New York who turned away vessels whose cargo of human misery was deemed too diseased for admission. It was during our second winter in Boston that we received the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a December morning when snow was falling steadily outside our boarding house, written in the careful script of Father McBride and dated 3 months earlier. The news was devastating in its simplicity. Our father had taken ill in November, weakened by 2 years of inadequate food and the stress of separation from his children. The consumption had claimed him within a week, so quickly that there had been no time to send word that might have brought us home for his final hours. Our mother, faced with the loss of her husband and the impossibility of maintaining their holding alone, had accepted accommodation in the workhouse at Mill Street. The workhouse was, we knew, the final destination for those who had exhausted all other possibilities. It was a place where the destitute might find shelter and minimal sustenance in exchange for labour that was designed more to punish poverty than to provide useful employment. Families were separated upon admission, husbands from wives, parents from children, in the belief that the bonds of affection made people less willing to accept the discipline that poverty required. Mare wept for 3 days upon receiving this news, and I confess that my own grief was so overwhelming that I could barely function. We had sustained ourselves through our own hardships, with the knowledge that our sacrifice was temporary, that success in America would eventually reunite our family under better circumstances. Now we learned that half our family no longer existed to be reunited, and the other half was trapped in conditions that represented a kind of living entombment. We immediately began making arrangements to send money for our mother's passage, but the logistics proved more complicated than we had anticipated. Communicating with someone in a workhouse required navigating bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed to discourage contact with the outside world. Even if we could reach her, the voyage itself presented dangers that seemed almost insurmountable for a woman alone, weakened by grief and institutional diet. It was then that we learned of the organisations that had been established to assist Irish immigrants in precisely such circumstances. The Irish Emigrant Society maintained offices in Boston, New York and Philadelphia, staffed by volunteers who understood the particular challenges faced by our people. Through their efforts, we were able to arrange not only for our mother's transportation, but for her care during the crossing and her reception upon arrival in America. She arrived the following spring, carried aboard a ship whose conditions had improved considerably from those we had endured 2 years earlier. The worst excesses of the coffin ships, as they had come to be known, had been curtailed by legislation that established minimum standards for food, water and sanitation. More importantly, the sheer volume of Irish emigration had created a commercial infrastructure that made such voyages more efficient and slightly more humane. Yet the woman who disembarked in Boston bore little resemblance to the mother we had left in County Cork. Bridget O'Brien had aged a decade in the space of 2 years. Her hair, once dark with streaks of premature grey, had become completely white. Her frame, always slight, had been reduced to the kind of fragility that suggested a strong wind might blow her away entirely. More disturbing were the changes in her spirit. The woman who had once sung while she worked, who had found joy in the smallest domestic victories, had been replaced by someone who moved through life with the mechanical precision of a person who had learned to expect nothing and hope for less. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was usually to confirm information rather than to initiate conversation. The reunion that we had anticipated as a moment of triumph proved instead to be a reminder of everything that had been lost. We were together again, but we were different people than we had been, shaped by experiences that had changed us in ways that mere geography could not heal. Ireland existed now only in our memories, and even those memories were being gradually transformed by distance and the necessities of our new lives. Our mother found accommodation in a boarding house for Irish widows, a charitable institution that provided modest lodging for women whose circumstances mirrored her own. She attempted various forms of employment taking in washing, caring for the children of working mothers, selling newspapers on street corners, but her health had been too severely compromised by her recent trials to sustain regular labour. Gradually, the three of us established a routine that provided some semblance of family life within the constraints of our economic circumstances. Sunday dinner became a weekly gathering where we shared whatever modest prosperity our individual efforts had generated. Mare had advanced to the position of head housemaid in the Whitman household, with wages that reflected her reliability and skill. My own situation had improved as well. I'd been promoted to crew supervisor on the railway project, earning nearly twice my original wages. Yet even as our material conditions improved, the emotional cost of our exodus continued to accumulate. We received occasional letters from Ireland that brought news of neighbours and relatives, but more often they brought word of final partings. Mrs. Kelly, who had brought her starving child to our door that terrible winter, had been found in her cabin one morning, having quietly reached her journey's end during the night. The Murphy family had emigrated to Australia, a destination so distant that we knew we would never see them again in this life. Perhaps most painfully, we learned that our old cabin had been abandoned and then demolished by order of the landlord, who had decided that the land could be more profitably used for grazing cattle than housing tenants. The stone walls that had sheltered generations of our family were now scattered across fields where sheep wandered with the indifference of creatures that had never known human attachment to place. As the years passed, Boston itself changed around us. The Irish population grew from a small community centred around the church and a few boarding houses to a substantial portion of the city's workforce. We established our own newspapers, our own societies, our own political organisations that reflected both our loyalty to America and our continued concern for the land of our birth. I married in 1851, taking as my wife Mary Catherine Flanagan, a young woman from Donegal who had arrived on one of the later ships when conditions had improved substantially. She brought to our union the particular strength of Irish women who had learned to make homes from whatever materials were available, to find joy in circumstances that others might find merely adequate. Our first child, Patrick, was born in 1852, the same year that news reached us of the official end of the Great Hunger. The potato blight had finally run its course, new crops were being planted, and the emergency measures that had characterised British policy toward Ireland were being gradually discontinued. Yet we all understood that the island to which we might theoretically return no longer existed, if it ever had. Mare never married, though she received several proposals from respectable Irish men who recognised her qualities. She seemed to have concluded that the cost of independence was too high to surrender for the doubtful benefits of matrimony. She continued in domestic service until she had accumulated sufficient capital to open her own establishment, a boarding house for Irish women that became a model for similar enterprises throughout the city. Our mother lived until 1858, long enough to see her grandson take his first steps and speak his first words in English that carried no trace of Irish accent. She died peacefully, in her sleep, during a particularly harsh winter, when the boarding house was filled with the sounds of immigrant women sharing stories and songs from the country they would never see again. We buried her in St. Augustine Cemetery, in a plot that overlooked Boston Harbour through which so many of our people had passed. The funeral was attended by dozens of Irish immigrants who had known her only slightly, but who understood that they were honouring not just one woman but the entire generation of Irish mothers who had sacrificed everything to give their children the possibility of survival. By 1860, 15 years after we had watched our potato field turn black with blight, I had become a man of modest property. The construction company that had employed me as a labourer now counted me as a partner, specialising in projects that required Irish workers who understood both the demands of American commerce and the particular skills of our transplanted countrymen. We owned our own home, a wooden house with glass windows, and a garden where Mary Catherine grew vegetables that supplemented our purchased food. Patrick was joined by 3 sisters, Bridget, named for my mother, Margaret, after Mary Catherine's mother, and Catherine, who carried the name of the saint who had protected our family through its journey from one world to another. They attended American schools where they learned American history and American geography, though at home they heard stories of Ireland that became more mythical with each telling. Yet for all our success, for all our integration into American society, we remained marked by the experience that had brought us there. The Great Hunger had taught us lessons about the fragility of security, the swiftness with which prosperity could disappear, the importance of maintaining reserves against disasters that might arrive without warning. We saved money, not just for comfort or advancement, but against the possibility of catastrophe. We bought property not merely as investment, but as tangible security that could not be destroyed by blight or policy changes in distant capitals. We maintained relationships within the Irish community, not simply from nostalgia, but from the practical knowledge that survival sometimes depended upon the willingness of people to support each other against a world that offered no guarantees. The children of the Hunger generation carried these lessons into American life, creating institutions and traditions that reflected both their gratitude for American opportunity and their hard-earned understanding that such opportunities could vanish as quickly as they had appeared. We built churches that were more solid than anything we had known in Ireland. We established banks and insurance companies and mutual aid societies that reflected our determination never again to face disaster without resources. In 1865, 20 years after that first terrible morning when we had discovered our rotted potato field, I received a letter from a distant cousin who had remained in Ireland throughout the worst years. He wrote of a country that was slowly recovering, where new crops were being successfully cultivated, where some of the abandoned villages were being resettled by families who had survived in the towns and cities. Yet he also wrote of changes that could never be undone. Entire regions of Ireland had been depopulated, their Gaelic-speaking communities scattered to America, Australia and England. The complex relationships between landlord and tenant that had characterised Irish rural life for centuries had been replaced by more commercial arrangements that reflected British notions of efficient agriculture. The Irish language itself was disappearing, replaced by English that offered better opportunities for those who hoped to participate in the modern world. Most significantly, he wrote of a change in the Irish character itself. The easy acceptance of authority that had marked our people's relationship with both British government and Catholic Church had been replaced by a more questioning attitude toward institutions that had failed so catastrophically during the years of greatest need. The Ireland that might eventually emerge from the catastrophe would be more suspicious of both political and religious authority, more willing to consider radical solutions to persistent problems. This letter prompted me to undertake a task I had been contemplating for several years. I began to write down my memories of the Hunger years, partly for my children, who would grow up knowing Ireland only through stories, but mainly for myself. The act of remembering served to fix experiences that were already beginning to fade in memory, to preserve details that might otherwise be lost in the general narrative of Irish immigration to America. What emerged from this effort was not simply a record of suffering, though suffering had certainly been central to our experience. Rather, it was a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to maintain dignity and hope even in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy both. The Great Hunger had not merely been a natural disaster that happened to affect Ireland. It had been a test of everything that Irish people believed about themselves, their relationship to their land, their obligations to each other, and their place in a world that often seemed indifferent to their survival. We had passed this test, but at enormous cost. The Ireland we carried in our memories was preserved like flowers pressed between the pages of a book, beautiful but no longer alive. The America we had discovered was real and substantial, offering opportunities that no amount of Irish patriotism could match, but it demanded in return the surrender of identities that had been shaped by centuries of shared experience. Our children would be Americans, not by choice but by birth and circumstance. They would speak English without accent, worship in churches indistinguishable from those attended by families whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower, compete for opportunities that had nothing to do with their parents' country of origin. They would be successful in ways that we could barely have imagined when we planted our first potato field in County Cork. Yet they would also carry within them something that purely American families lacked, the the knowledge that prosperity was fragile, that disaster could arrive without warning, that survival sometimes depended upon the willingness to abandon everything familiar in pursuit of the merely possible. This knowledge, born of catastrophe and nurtured by exile, would prove to be among the most valuable gifts we could offer to our adopted country. In 1882, 37 years after the blight first appeared in our fields, I made a journey back to Ireland. The occasion was the wedding of my cousin's son, the first celebration in our family that seemed to promise continuity rather than mere survival. The island I found bore little resemblance to the country we had fled. The railways had arrived, connecting even remote districts to the commercial centres of Dublin and Cork. The cabins in which we had lived had been largely replaced by more substantial houses, with glass windows and slate roofs. Most remarkably, the potato was once again a major crop, cultivated with scientific methods that reduced the risk of the kind of total failure that had devastated our generation. Yet the changes went deeper than material improvements. The Ireland of 1882 was more literate, more politically aware, more willing to challenge the assumptions that had governed relationships between Ireland and England for centuries. The easy acceptance of authority that had characterised my father's generation had been replaced by a more questioning attitude that reflected the lessons learned during the years when established institutions had proven so inadequate to basic human needs. I walked through the district where our family had lived for generations, finding few traces of the community I remembered. The stone walls that had marked field boundaries had been removed to create larger, more efficient farms. The church where we had worshipped had been enlarged and modernised beyond recognition. Most striking of all, I encountered few people who remembered the families that had lived there during my youth. The catastrophe had been so complete that it had broken not only the economic relationships that had sustained rural Irish life, but also the continuity of memory that had preserved local history for centuries. On my final morning in Ireland, I visited the site where our cabin had stood. Nothing remained but a slight depression in the ground and a few scattered stones that might once have formed our walls. The field where we had grown our potatoes was now pasture, grazed by cattle that belonged to a farmer who had purchased the land from Mr. Hartwell's estate. Standing there in the grey Irish morning, listening to the familiar sound of rain beginning to fall, I understood finally what our emigration had accomplished. We had not simply moved from one place to another. We had travelled from one century to another, from one way of understanding human possibilities to another. The Great Hunger had not merely been a temporary crisis that had displaced a portion of the Irish population. It had been the end of a world, the final collapse of social and economic relationships that had governed Irish life since the Middle Ages. The island that was emerging in the 1880s was in many ways more prosperous and certainly more modern than the country we had fled, but it was also a fundamentally different place, shaped by the knowledge that traditional ways of life offered no guarantee of survival, that security depended upon adaptation to forces that originated far beyond the familiar boundaries of local community. We, who had emigrated, had learned these lessons in America, where the demands of survival had forced us to develop new skills and new ways of understanding our place in the world. Those who had remained in Ireland had learned them at home, through experiences that had been no less transformative for being geographically contained. The reunion with my surviving relatives was warm but strange. We shared memories and family news with genuine affection, but we also recognized that we had become different kinds of people, shaped by experiences that could be described but not fully communicated. They had survived the hunger in Ireland and had adapted to the changed circumstances that followed. We had survived it in America and had adapted to challenges that were different, but no less demanding. When I returned to Boston, I found my family preparing for another kind of transition. Patrick, now 30 years old, had announced his intention to move west to California, where opportunities in railroad construction promised advancement that was no longer available in the increasingly crowded cities of the eastern seaboard. Two of my daughters had married men whose families had been in America for generations, and their children would grow up with no particular sense of Irish identity beyond the stories their grandparents told. Only Bridget, my youngest daughter, seemed to have inherited something of the Irish temperament that had sustained our people through centuries of difficulty. She had become involved in the Irish nationalist movement that was gaining strength in American cities, raising funds and political support for the struggle for Irish independence that was beginning to take shape in the old country. Through her involvement in these activities, I began to understand that our emigration had not simply removed us from Irish history, but had given us a different role in its continuing development. Irish Americans possessed resources, financial, political and emotional, that could influence events in Ireland in ways that would have been impossible had we remained as tenant farmers in County Cork. The money that Irish immigrants sent home to bring over relatives also supported political movements that challenged British rule. The political skills that Irish Americans developed through participation in American democracy provided models for similar efforts in Ireland. Most importantly, the very success of Irish emigrants in America demonstrated that Irish people were capable of achievements that the colonial system had never permitted them to attempt. By 1890, 45 years after our emigration, I had lived longer in America than I had in Ireland. My accent had been tempered by decades of American speech, my mannerisms shaped by American customs, my expectations formed by American possibilities. Yet the experiences of my youth continued to influence my understanding of the world in ways that distinguished me from Americans whose families had never known hunger or exile. I continued to save money against disasters that my American-born neighbors could not imagine. I maintained relationships with people based not simply on common interests, but on shared memories of hardship that created bonds deeper than friendship. Most significantly, I understood in ways that more fortunate people could not, that the prosperity and security we enjoyed in America were achievements that required constant vigilance and effort to preserve. These lessons proved valuable when economic depression struck America in 1893. While other families struggled to adjust to suddenly reduced circumstances, those of us who had learned caution during the hunger years were better prepared to weather temporary setbacks. We had savings accumulated against exactly such possibilities. We had skills and experience in making do with less. Most importantly, we understood that even severe hardships were survivable if approached with the right combination of determination and flexibility. My business survived the depression and eventually prospered during the economic recovery that followed. Patrick established himself successfully in San Francisco, where his Irish background proved to be an asset rather than a liability in a city that valued enterprise more than ancestry. My daughters raised families that contributed to American society while maintaining enough sense of their Irish heritage to understand the sacrifices that had made their American opportunities possible. Mare never married, but became something of a figure in Boston Irish society, known for her charitable work and her ability to assist new immigrants in making the transition to American life. She established a network of boarding houses and employment services that helped thousands of Irish women find respectable work and decent accommodation in a city that was not always welcoming to newcomers. Mary Catherine and I celebrated our golden wedding anniversary in 1901, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose success in America validated every sacrifice we had made during the years of struggle. We lived to see the dawn of the 20th century, to witness technological innovations that would have seemed like magic to the young people who had planted potatoes in County Cork. Yet for all our material success, for all our integration into American society, we never entirely lost the perspective that had been shaped by our experience of the Great Hunger. We understood, in ways that more fortunate people could not, that civilization was fragile, that prosperity could vanish overnight, that survival often depended upon the willingness to abandon familiar securities in pursuit of uncertain possibilities. This knowledge made us more appreciative of the opportunities we had found in America, but also more aware of our obligations to those who continued to struggle. We supported charities that assisted immigrants. We participated in political movements that challenged injustice. We maintained connections with Ireland that reflected our continuing concern for the land of our birth, even as we committed ourselves fully to the land of our choice. When I began writing these memories, I intended them primarily as a record for my descendants, a way of preserving experiences that might otherwise be forgotten as the generations passed. But as I have continued this work over the years, I have come to understand that the story of the Great Hunger is not simply Irish history, but American history as well. The million Irish people who emigrated during the famine years brought to America not just their labour and their loyalty, but also their hard-earned understanding of what it meant to lose everything and begin again. They contributed to American society not merely through their individual achievements, but through their collective demonstration that people could maintain their dignity and their humanity, even in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy both. The institutions they built, churches, schools, hospitals, political organizations, reflected both their gratitude for American opportunity and their determination to ensure that others would not face alone the challenges they had confronted in isolation. The traditions they maintained provided continuity with the past while adapting to the demands of the present. The stories they told taught their children to appreciate what they had while remembering what it had cost to achieve. Perhaps most importantly, they brought to America a particular understanding of what it meant to be truly free. Having experienced the consequences of colonial rule, of dependence upon distant authorities who showed little concern for the welfare of those they governed, Irish immigrants understood that American democracy was not simply a political system, but a precious achievement that required active participation to preserve. They voted, they organised, they ran for office, they served on juries, they participated in all the institutions of democratic government with the enthusiasm of people who understood that such opportunities were not available everywhere and might not last forever without vigilant protection. Their involvement in American political life brought to it a perspective that had been shaped by experience of what happened when ordinary people had no voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The America that emerged from the 19th century was different, partly because of the contributions of Irish immigrants, who had learned through bitter experience that freedom was not a natural condition but an achievement that required constant effort to maintain. Their children and grandchildren carried these lessons forward, contributing to social movements that challenged injustice and expanded opportunity for all Americans. As I complete these memories in the early years of the 20th century, more than half a century after the events that shaped them, I am struck by how much has changed and how much has remained constant. The immediate crisis that drove us from Ireland has long since passed. The Ireland of today is more prosperous, more modern and more hopeful than the country we left in 1847. Yet the fundamental lessons learned during those terrible years remain as relevant today as they were then. Prosperity is fragile and must be carefully tended. Security depends upon the willingness to work together, rather than simply compete with one another. Survival sometimes requires the courage to abandon familiar comforts in pursuit of uncertain possibilities. And human dignity can be maintained even in circumstances that seem designed to destroy it, if people are willing to support each other and maintain their faith in better possibilities. These lessons, learned at such terrible cost by my generation, have become part of the American character through the contributions of millions of immigrants who brought to this country not just their labour, but their hard-earned wisdom about what it meant to survive and flourish in an uncertain world. The Great Hunger ended more than 50 years ago, but its lessons continue to shape the character of the nation that gave refuge to those who fled its consequences. In that sense, the catastrophe that devastated Ireland became also a source of strength for America, demonstrating once again that human beings possess an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and renewal when they are given the opportunity to exercise it. The Ireland we left behind exists now only in memory, preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of time. The America we found and helped to build continues to evolve, shaped by successive waves of immigrants who bring their own experiences of hardship and hope to the continuing experiment in human freedom that is the defining characteristic of this nation. We who survived the Great Hunger and made new lives in America have earned our place in both histories. We are part of the Irish story of suffering and survival, and part of the American story of opportunity and achievement. Our children and grandchildren will carry forward both legacies, contributing to the continuing development of societies that offer hope to those who seek better lives for themselves and their families. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that human beings possess an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and renewal when they are given the opportunity to exercise it, and that the greatest gift one generation can give to the next is the knowledge that even the most difficult circumstances can be overcome through determination, mutual support, and faith in better possibilities. The long hunger of my youth ended many years ago, but the lessons it taught continue to nourish not only my own understanding of life, but the character of the nation that gave us refuge when we needed it most. In that transformation of catastrophe into contribution, of exile into opportunity, lies perhaps the most hopeful message that any generation can leave to those who follow. That the human spirit, tested by hardship but not broken by it, can find ways to create meaning and purpose, even from the most difficult experiences. This is the story I leave to my children and grandchildren, and through them, to the America that has been our home for more than half a century. It is a story of loss and survival, of exile and adaptation, of individual struggle and collective achievement. But above all, it is a story of hope that sustained us through the darkest years, hope that brought us across an ocean to a new world, hope that continues to guide us as we work to build that world into something worthy of the sacrifices that made our survival possible. The fields of County Cork lie far behind us now, across an ocean of time as well as water. But the lessons learned in those fields, during those terrible years when the earth itself seemed to fail, continue to guide us as we tend new fields in a land that has given us opportunities our ancestors could never have imagined. In that continuity between past and present, between loss and discovery, between Ireland and America, lies the true meaning of our journey and the true value of our survival. Thus concludes the memoir of Seamus O'Brien, written in Boston, Massachusetts, in the year of our Lord 1905, for his children and their children after them, that they might understand the price that was paid for the life they know, and the hope that sustained those who paid it.